Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Marcia.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we have a special episode. We're not going to focus on a single movie or TV show, but instead on an overarching theme in World War II media. We're going to talk about myth-making and historical perspective and war media as propaganda. And we're super fortunate because we have our second guest ever on the series, our friend Sam. And the reason why we invited them to be on is because they just have the most amazing takes. Anytime anything historical comes up and we're talking about that, they always have tons of awesome insights. So we're really looking forward to getting into this discussion with them. But we're going to spend some time focusing on American war media because of the scale of their media industry and the pervasiveness of this kind of idea of the American on the world stage. But we will touch on other countries, including our own. It's really cool because we have three different perspectives. Obviously, I'm Canadian, Mart is Dutch, and Sam is from the Philippines. So that's pretty cool. And by no means is this going to be comprehensive because this topic is huge, but we will try and hit some kind of interesting highlights. We'll mention sources wherever possible so listeners can do further research. And we will also list our sources in the show notes. So with that said, with our three sort of distinct national perspectives, maybe each of us can talk about how, like, our journey to sort of our current understanding of war media as quote unquote having an agenda. Mart, do you want to go first?
Sure. First of all, let me say welcome to other Sam. Thank you for being on our show.
That one.
Yep, that
This
one.
one.
We were talking about this before about how it's going to be really easy for me because if I say Sam, I'm obviously not talking about myself, but Mart is going to have to figure out the two Sam situation.
I'm going to say Sam for regular Sam and then Sam me for our guest. Just so you know.
That's sweet. Yeah. Okay.
As you all know by now, I'm Dutch. So most of the war media I've consumed is not Dutch, but it's also just American. We do have a little bit of a film industry here in the Netherlands, so we do get some Dutch war movies. But before I started this podcast, I pretty much took American war media as it was. I didn't think about it so much. And then we started this podcast together and I changed my mind a little bit. I was really afraid it was gonna interfere with my enjoyment of movies, but it really doesn't. It's really nice to be able to enjoy something as well as criticize it. So I really quite like that aspect of this.
Hell yeah. Sam, do you want to take it away next?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm kind of very similar in that I enjoy being critical with media. Like my background was always history and literature, even as a kid. So anything that I was exposed to, I always had questions of why was it like this? Why was it depicted this way? Why was it depicted that way? I was not a very fun child to be around when I had like movie nights with my parents. Like my dad was like, listen, and my dad's part of the military here in our country. I was very much exposed to it at a very young age. He still is actually. And I was as well. You know, I talk about that a lot. I'm so sorry. That was like one of my first big kid jobs. So I've been like, you know, exposed to a lot of war media as well as the inner machinations of the military at a very young age. So a lot of the things that are depicted in war media I've always had. It was always uncomfortable for me. And then obviously I learned literature and critical reading. And then, you know, something that became uncomfortable, I guess, became fun.
Can I ask you something? Can I ask you about your dad? What does he do in the military?
Oh, that is hot secret. You know Lewis Nixon? That's why I know so much about Lewis Nixon. That's my dad.
Ah, cool.
So he deals with that. And then I went into the same industry and then I hated it. I said, nope, never mind. So yeah, he still does it now. So yeah.
I'm just curious. I find that in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada, but it still happens, people present the military as this like, yeah, you go into the military, you only have to do like a few years and they'll pay for your school and you get great pay. And you like people present it as this really like positive job alternative. I wonder if it's the same where you are.
Yeah, it's very much the same. Though for us, I think it's a little bit more underhanded. I mean, if you ever meet a happy Filipino, they're lying. They really do like, it's a lot of underhanded, like as somebody who has been in it for a while, sometimes they're like, oh yeah, military, so great. You always have a job, etc., etc. Because the government never runs out of job. But it's also like, oh God, the police, everybody, there is a sense of like, yeah, I guess the military, but also a sense of like deep, deep distrust in the authority, especially because martial law happened. Like, well, the effects of martial law are still very much felt. And the military had like a huge, they were very abusive during the dictatorship. So a lot of people still remember that. But lately, because of, not to get into politics, lately, because of a lot of, we call it historical revisionism, which was perpetrated by the current president, which is the son of the dictator that took over in the 70s, Bongbong Marcos. He sucks. He's terrible. He's awful. But his family conducted a sort of like mass historical revisionism. There's not much education amongst the Philippine people. Poverty is quite high. Illiteracy is quite high. So people are back to sort of praising the Marcos name. But hilariously enough, the thing that sort of stays is this deep distrust of military authority, which I never clocked until I was in high school, because that's when people would freely talk around the kids, be like, oh yeah, this and that and this and that. They used to hide it a little bit from the children when we were kids. But even then, as a kid, they were like, oh, don't go near. If something goes wrong, maybe don't go near the police. Or like, especially if you're I was raised a girl. So the police are not quite as trusted here as they are in other countries, because a lot of their crimes are very public and reported on, and it's just bad.
That's super interesting. No, like definitely feel free to tell us all kinds of stuff about this, because we talked about this briefly yesterday, but my understanding of Filipino history is a little limited. So I'm enjoying hearing about this. So don't, yeah. Well, for me, I feel like 9/11 happened when I was like 13 years old, and sort of coming of age in that immediately post 9/11 era was really interesting. I think it would be tough if you didn't, to sort of imagine what it was like. But immediately we all, and I think this part of this is like, when you live in Canada, we have a sort of interesting relationship with the United States. We're the little brother. We have a chip on our shoulder a little bit about it. There's this like quote from one of our prime ministers, I believe, where living next to the United States is like sleeping next to an elephant, where they don't necessarily mean you any harm, but you have to be really aware of every movement of the elephant. And so sort of we were like very, very aware of what was going on in like, Afghanistan, Iraq. Canada did send troops to Afghanistan as well. And so I feel like a lot of us in Canada immediately became sort of very critical of the American administration. And then through that, I became aware of the fact that not all media that you're watching is necessarily telling you the truth, or it has a certain agenda to spin things in a certain way. And then I went to university, I got a history degree. I took a course called Fascism on Film, where we did analysis of all these movies that came out during the fascist era and afterwards about fascism. And so I definitely took an interest in that. And yeah, I'm excited that we're taking this turn on the podcast, because like you, I'm really interested in being critical about things that I like. Even if I like them, doesn't mean that I can't be like, all right, well, like, why are they saying this? And like, why is this the sort of nature of this movie and that sort of stuff?
Can I make a little bit of an addition to my own stuff that I said before? Until I was well into my 20s, I had a really limited worldview. I was a little bit sheepish, like following whatever I was being told. I don't know why I was like that. But then I started seeing different points of view, and I started talking maybe to my dad a little more, who's very educated, likes to read, even more than I do. So it took me a while to become critical of just about anything in the world. And now it's kind of nice to be critical at the same time. It's sometimes a lot of work to be critical, or just sometimes I just want to enjoy stuff, and not think about it all the time. So I tend to pick and choose when to do my research, or when I feel like it, versus when I just want to enjoy something. So I'm still working on it, I would say.
Hell yeah.
No, but that's really valid. Sometimes you just want to switch your brain off.
Right. And enjoy your favorite characters doing crazy shit.
Yeah.
Right?
You don't need to go like, oh yeah, well that is a war crime.
Yeah. Speaking of that, we'll definitely talk about Band of Brothers and our other HBO war properties later, because we are all interested in those properties as well, but we're aware that there are some issues. We've all approached this topic with the same assumption, which is that media like Band of Brothers is innately war propaganda. And I know that for all of us, we just assume this to be true. But I recently saw a Tumblr post where someone was like, well, of course, Band of Brothers is not propaganda. So I don't think this is a universal idea. So I wonder if maybe we want to like touch on why we think that, or maybe a little bit around that idea.
You know, that really Christian quote where like the devil's biggest play is that he convinced you that he's not real. Like, I feel like that's sort of like how I approach propaganda, and it's so pervasive. And if you are not, I wouldn't want to say trained, but I guess that's one way of putting it. If you are not used to seeing patterns in narratives or connecting a narrative to what is going on outside of it, like the production and the history of, or at the time in which it is being made, etc. If you're not used to seeing these connections, and if you consume a piece of media as just a piece of media, it will be very easy for you to go, oh, I don't think that's propaganda. I think that's a story about a bunch of guys who overcame a very big, very dangerous time in history. And that's understandable. I guess it's because I'm surrounded by academics and people who think critical literary consumption is fun. But like my mom is not like that. So when I go, oh yeah, that's, this is very insidious because of this, or this is definitely a propaganda for this, she goes, oh, really? I didn't think of that. And that's understandable. There's nothing wrong with that. It just is definitely a sort of like way of, if you yourself are not used to seeing it, and if you just consume media and enjoy it in such a way that is uncritical, that's completely fine as well, But also at the same time, it should be said that I don't want to turn this into an endorsement of like, you should be critical of all the media you love, because that's just no fun. But also at the same time, people like us are like, oh yeah, and then we can discuss this. I love watching flaws in all my favorite characters, but there are definitely some people who are like, nah, I would rather just
that's also fine.
Yeah,
right?
that's fine,
Yeah, I want to respond to something you said about Band of Brothers being the story about these group of guys just overcoming this big evil or this big adventure. I feel like both things can be true at the same time. Like, it can be that as well as propaganda.
So moving on to part one, we thought we would have a little bit of a discussion about American war media. As I said before, the American movie industry is huge. And I would say that probably most of the war movies that people have seen tend to be American. Obviously, there's other countries with movie industries as well, but they're just very pervasive. They get a huge international audience. And so I thought we could start by talking about how we and our countrymen perceive American involvement in World War II, because I'm sure that's going to be quite different across the three of us. Sam, do you want to go first for this one?
Sure. I guess, well, before like I get into it, I think I should start with like, it's really weird. This is just personal thing. It's really weird how oddly fascinated Americans are with World War II. I've talked about it quite a bit of like World War II nostalgia and how that pushed the Bush regime into doing, the War of Terror, 9/11, and how, us, a country who's been like clamoring, who's like, whose entire economy and entire government is almost seemingly like run by war. The fact that in the 90s they didn't have a war to run it or to have a war to fund it made them so thirsty for war that they just sort of viewed World War II in a certain lens. And it's just so funny considering how, like, we're not going to talk about the Vietnam War, are we? Or the Korean War after that, are we? And it's so weird as somebody who is from a country for whom war is not sort of a happy thing, for somebody who's been raised to remember colonization and fighting and meaningless war and being collateral damage between world powers. It's like, it's so, I wouldn't want to say insidious without an American here to like defend themselves, but definitely it feels a little insidious in that they're so fascinated by this part of their history wherein they can so easily frame themselves as a sort of hero. But anyway, that's just me. It's just literally just me going, that's weird. That's weird.
No, I
But
mean
like
you're right.
for
I think a lot of people might not be aware that with the Gulf War, late 80s, early 90s, George H.W.
mm,
Bush very explicitly framed it as, well, this is sort of we're going to kick Vietnam syndrome. We're going to have one where we can go in and have our glorious victory, and then we won't have to be the country that did Vietnam anymore. And then even
mm,
after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall came down, American defense spending just continued to go up. And theoretically, you would think you don't have this antagonist anymore. Like, what are we doing?
like you could put that money somewhere else, George. But he doesn't, because that's not how the country's run, and it was never built that way, which is, it's kind of sad if you think about it.
Like it becomes this larger
Mm.
than life thing instead of what it actually was.
Yeah, I think of it as like this glorious battle that brought us to this glory.
Yeah. And I wonder how many Americans know that the Americans were occupying the Philippines and then they sort of bailed on you guys when the Japanese got there.
Yeah, they did. They just bailed, which is so funny. I don't know if you know about this, but there's this whole part when you're teaching a Filipino kid history. World War II is like very barely touched on. Like a lot of World War II, even like media for us, it's very much, oh, the abuses of the Japanese, the abuses of this. And then there's always a footnote at the end of General MacArthur going, I shall return. And it's sort of framed in such a way. He was the general that was in charge of the Philippines during World War II, and he left. He just left. He left with our president at the time, president of the Commonwealth, Quezon, and his wife and his vice president, which is this whole other can of worms. But this idea of like this American figure going, don't worry, I'll come back for you. It's like so unbelievably like benevolent, and it's not at all malicious the way that it's framed. And I remember thinking as a kid, like, you don't have, why'd you leave? That's not, I was so angry. I was so angry. I remember just being like, but why would they leave? And my professors or my teachers at the time looking at this child who's like so close to tears, like, why would they leave? I thought they're supposed to be taking care of us, right? That's the point, right? And they're like, well, I don't really know how to explain this to a child, but they suck. Yeah, but it's this whole thing. And there's like statues. And the worst thing is like, the funniest thing about that is General MacArthur, at the time when he came back, World War II, he was vying for presidency. So there was this statue. God, I forgot where they landed. They landed somewhere in a province that was near water. I'm so sorry. Somebody's going to come in and take my history degree soon. I forgot. I completely and utterly forgot. But there's a statue of him looking so suave with his sunglasses on. But the myth of that statue is that when he first landed on the beach, he tripped and a photographer got it. And he was like, no, that's not good enough. We'll do it again. So they did it 3 or 4 more times. This like, oh, I'm coming back, Philippines. Like that, sir.
Can I ask you something relevant to the war media? And how is war media perceived in the Philippines then, like American war media, like Band Brothers specific? Is it at all popular, or is it more like a niche?
Not. Surprisingly, it's not. Because a lot of Philippine media, we don't like to think about history as like a thing because it's so tragic and it's just not good to think about. A lot of our education is definitely based on American education. So there is an emphasis on patriotism, and there's not really much to be proud about if you're Filipino, particularly in history, because everything is just one big tragedy after tragedy. And as somebody who loves like tragic literature, as a tragedy enjoyer, I say this quite a lot. As a tragedy enjoyer, Philippine history is probably my favorite tragedy. It's like there are people there who are like, they're trying so hard, they're doing their best, they're just trying to save themselves and their family. And it doesn't always work out, or it works out, but in the worst way possible. Like so many monkeys' paws in Philippine history, as well as just tragic endings, that as a person who like enjoys tragic literature, you're like, or tragic narratives, you're like, oh, that's nice, actually. That's nice. It's all circular. But as somebody who lives here and whose history or whose existence is so affected by what happened in history, it makes you angry. It makes you angry. It makes you very sad. But, I'm me and a very, like, I only know a few people who willingly think about history in such a way. I have an academic background and I definitely punish myself, I guess would be the great way of saying it when it comes to history. So I like looking at things and I like seeing the patterns and everything. The everyday Filipino does not. And we enjoy stories that if you look at Philippine cinema, mainstream cinema, it's usually comedies, rom-coms, dramas that have a happy ending. Just to make you feel better, honestly. And action films. There was a time in our history where we had action films that are like the fight scenes would last several, probably 45 minutes to 55 minutes, simply because they like to see this big hero taking on something. So, I guess if they were ever to be exposed to American World War II media, they would like it in that, oh, this is very clearly a narrative about somebody going up against a very big bad thing and then winning. And that part of American media is definitely, I guess, very intriguing to the Filipino watcher. But we don't really get World War II American media a lot because obviously English, first of all, as a language, is not quite as accessible for other people. And we do have Filipino dubs, but they obviously prefer to dub things like anime or romance films or Marvel films.
I have to know now. Is there a Filipino dub Band of Brothers?
Oh God, if there was, are you kidding me? I would watch that every day. It would be so funny. It would be so funny. Just imagining a Filipino person, Major Win. No, oh no. You imagine the accent. I can't. I cannot. I will never take it seriously.
We'll probably get into it a bit more later, but Canada has a movie industry, but it's not anywhere near on the same scale as the US industry, just resource-wise, output-wise. And so growing up, I watched a lot of American war media because we didn't really have our own. And yeah, so I think that there's definitely this like popular perception that broadly that what we see in American war media is true, that the Americans were the good guys, that they went in and they did what had to be done and they were staving off authoritarianism, etc. I think to some degree, Canadians are very aware of Canadian involvement in both world wars. And then if you talk to the average American, they have no idea what Canada did in the world wars, because in the sort of overall scheme of things, the contribution was much smaller, but per capita, it was not. Like during World War II, there were 11 million Canadians and 1 million Canadians served. And so it was a huge percentage of the population, but in the overall, sort of just a flash in the pan in terms of like the overall size, just number of people. And so I think there's also this sense of like, the Americans take all the credit, but like we were there too. We were there fighting for however long before the Americans even got involved in both world wars. So I think there's also this sense in that way.
That makes sense. And it's funny, if I can kind of take your point about Canadians being there as well. If we look at the Dutch, we were occupied by the Germans. We weren't an active part as a military force so much in World War II. But I think the Dutch do see the Americans as not necessarily as saviors, but we do have a warmer relationship with the Canadians, who to us, I think, are much more the saviors than the Americans were. There were so many more Americans, but the Canadians were like our buddies.
Yeah, y'all send us tulips every year. We have a whole bunch of tulips on Parliament Hill.
Yeah.
I think my first brush with Canada in World War II was the Anne of Green Gables movie that they made up in the books. Like Gilbert was military and then he went MIA. I think that's my first brush. Canadian World War II shenanigans.
Listen, we love some Anna Green Gables here in Canada, but I hear she's also like super popular internationally. So let's talk about why the US got involved in World War II, or why did everyday Americans join up in World War II, and sort of the reality versus the fiction of that. Because I've done a lot of reading on this, especially in recent weeks, because we're doing this episode. And yeah, I think there's this strange, decades and decades later, there's this sort of view of Americans in World War II as just like a monolith. And there's this very like, okay, well, this is why we went to war, and this is why people joined up and this is whatever. But during the war and immediately after, there really wasn't this sort of consensus in the way that we perceive it. And so I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I read something in preparation for this podcast. It stated that America's reasons to join the war in Europe wasn't so much to play the savior and to go and save Europe, but it was rather that they were being attacked by Japan, and I think America would like us to believe that they're the savior and that they were doing this selfless act by helping us in Europe, but they were attacked, so they were kind of defending their own, which is a legitimate reason, I say, to go to war. And I do think that the soldiers going overseas were pretty selfless, but America's choice to join just wasn't as selfless as it was made out to be later.
I think it's interesting, too, the fact that, well, obviously the US was very isolationist in the 1930s. And of course, there were people that wanted to intervene in the war, but there were a lot of people that did not. And there was a lot of sort of contention around when the US first initiated the draft, it was a peacetime draft. They weren't at war yet. And we had something similar in Canada where when the government initiated the draft, it had been so unpopular in World War I that it almost caused a national crisis because French Canadians didn't view the war as their war. And especially in terms of World War I, they were saying, look, the British Crown is dragging us into this. We don't have a choice. We don't want to be involved. And it caused this huge schism in the country. And so in World War II, the government was very cautious to say, okay, we're going to have a draft, but you don't have to go overseas unless you put your hand up and volunteer. And so that was a huge part of it. And so I think that people today often perceive like, oh, everyone was very like gung-ho to join up and go overseas, but I don't think that necessarily was the case.
I agree. And that's the case for Americans too, right? Like, there were lots of people who didn't agree with America's involvement, and there was like a big Nazi movement in America too. So let's not forget, they weren't all opposed to Hitler's ideas either.
I'm not gonna say the Philippines was drafted, but I definitely do remember seeing photographs from the early 1930s, 1940s of the German consulate here in Manila. There were Nazi flags flying there. There was definitely an air of, let them be. Just let them be. It's fine. It's not our war yet. Until, of course, Pearl Harbor happened and things started going, I wouldn't say south, but definitely down that shaft. And it was just so weird, especially because in the Philippines, it was so close to Japan. So there was definitely that push already of Japan's coming. And there was very much tension when it came to Japan is so close. We're definitely in the path of destruction next. But it's more whispers, really, than there was an outright panic. We have to do something now because the government was still very much American. And it was the Philippine Commonwealth led by Manuel L. Quezon. Almost all whispers of like World War II were not necessarily as tension-filled as it might have been in other countries like China or Korea, who were already being actively colonized by Japan. So there definitely was a sort of calm before the storm, before anything happened. And then when things happened, it happened very, very fast.
I do also wonder, because America's so far away from Europe, where most of this was hitting off, like before Pearl Harbor at least, if a lot of Americans would have thought, well, it's far away, it's not my problem. I feel like that would have also definitely been a common thought for many Americans, which, I don't know, kind of makes sense to me, too.
Right. You're definitely right. I was doing a bit of reading and I came across these like travel guides that the US War Department had issued to American GIs serving overseas, because a lot of them had never been more than 50 miles outside of their hometown, right? It's like, why is it our problem to deal with something that's happening across the ocean? And like, honestly, you're right. Like, can you blame them for the most part?
No. In this entire discussion, I want to make a little bit of a separation between the commanding powers and the common soldier volunteering to fight in this war, because I think it's very brave if you're 18 or 19 or even younger, or to go volunteer for a war that's further away than you've ever been from home with an uncertain outcome.
Yeah. Number one, a lot of the reasons why people served are probably as diverse as the people who did serve. And I think we also can't forget that a lot of this is tied up in the concept of masculinity at the time, where it's like well, if I don't go, I'm going to miss out and all the other guys will have gone. And people felt the need to join up and prove themselves and that sort of thing. And also, we're coming up on the end of probably the hardest 10 years that,
Aggression, yeah.
happened in American history. And so
Yeah.
a lot of people were coming out of a span of time, their childhoods, where they had nothing. And so to be on the edge of, okay, well, if I join the military, I'm going to be able to get out of my hometown. I'm going to be able to make some money. I'm going to be, kind of go off into the unknown. Like, of course, that was also a part of it.
Yes.
Yeah. It's very hero's journey, so to speak. After years of toiling and being the underdog, I can now prove myself. And there was definitely an emphasis on the idea of proving yourself and making America proud in that way.
I just pulled up this quote. It's from Looking for the Good War by Elizabeth Samet. And she says, by February 1942, a large portion of the American population was still confused about war aims and insufficiently committed to the war effort. 6 months into the country's involvement, 53% of Americans polled admitted that they did not have a clear idea of what the war was about. And in the service of that, I also watched this documentary called Five Came Back, which is about these 5 Hollywood directors who essentially enlisted in the army to make war propaganda for the government. And the reason why that happened was because the government knew that this was the case. They were like, well, it's going to be hard to get people to be motivated if they don't really know what they're fighting for. So I think in the wake of the war, there's the episode Why We Fight of Band of Brothers, right, where they liberate the concentration camp. And I think there is this sort of lingering sense that that was one of the reasons why Americans went to war. And truthfully, it really was a case of consequence becoming justification. They liberated the camps as a consequence of winning the war. And then it became, this is why we went to war. But that was not true.
Yeah. The funniest thing about that episode is how it was named, one, and the narrative of the episode is like, oh, we didn't know. We stumbled on this camp. And oh, it reflects very much what happened, but it frames it in such a way that's like, see, look, we did the right thing. Like, no, you were literally. It's so funny how it tried to frame it as if they knew all along, but they didn't know all along.
I kind of disagree on that, actually. To me, it really seems like they were actually surprised.
I meant like, because there are 2 perspectives within that episode, right? Because it's an episode in hindsight. So it's the Band of Brothers writers who are framing it like, oh yeah, we fought for this. But the characters within the narrative, we didn't know about this.
I guess it's not as obvious to me. I don't really see it in that episode. That never occurred to me before. Okay. I would say it's one of the best episodes of the series for me. Because it's a lot more honest than some of the others. So, I don't know.
Well, I think part of the issue as well is that I think people underestimate the real and pervasive sense of like anti-Semitism in America, but also, of course, like everywhere around the world in the 1940s. And in Canada recently, our prime minister apologized because a ship of Jewish refugees came here in 1939 and we turned them away and a whole bunch of them died in the camps. And that was the sense of it was like, well, we don't want them here. And anti-Semitism was pretty widespread. And I feel like that episode is a bit disingenuous in that way, where it's like, there's just no acknowledgement of that at all.
Yeah. I think the thing that makes me mad about that episode, though I do agree that it's a very well done episode in that it's honest and that we didn't know, and we're now confronted by the horrors that we didn't even know we were fighting against, that Germany was this bad. But it's the title. It's the title, Why We Fight.
That makes sense to me.
Let's move into how was U.S. involvement viewed during the war versus afterwards by the Americans, because I listened to this podcast called 1 Year 1942, and I highly recommend it. They cover a bunch of topics of stuff that happened in 1942, cultural stuff and political stuff and all kinds of things. They talk about how during the early part of the war in 1942, of course, after Pearl Harbor, there were these constant directives about rationing, the price of goods, the price of rent, the price of food. And they put these strict speed rules into effect because they needed rubber for the military. And Americans just refused to stop driving and refused to drive slower and refused to trade their tires in. So the government was like, fine, if you're going to do that, we're going to have a fuel restriction so that you have to drive less. And there was the polls that showed a third of Americans didn't even believe rationing was necessary. There were black markets all over the place. And that year when they had an election, the Democrats actually got trounced. And a lot of people attributed that to the unpopularity of rationing. And the guy who was the quote unquote head of the Office of Price Administration, Leon Henderson, he got fired because they basically blamed him for losing the election. There was all this propaganda that came in later years that was like, yeah, Americans were united and they banded together and everybody did their bit and everybody was rationing and following the letter of the law. And we were all 100% committed to the war effort. And that's just not really true. And of course, it's not true. Like we just saw this during COVID, right? People are very like, they don't want the government to tell them what to do. And people are infinite and nuanced and all this stuff. So it's just interesting. There's this story of we'd love to go back to a time where everyone was united. And it's like, well, that time actually doesn't really exist.
I can only agree, to be honest, with this. And maybe we'll come on to this later also, but it was the same in the Netherlands, really, even though we were occupied. I don't know any numbers, so I can't really attest to any of that. But there were people in the Netherlands who agreed with the Germans. So the Dutch really want to say we were oppressed, all of us were the victims, and we were all against the Germans, which really wasn't true at all. So I think it would be the same for about any country, but specifically in the US because it's so far away. And then there's, I guess, the regular American that wasn't in the war wouldn't maybe feel as much need either to do what they were being told to do.
Yeah, just the fact that there were these substantial propaganda campaigns, posters and newsreels and radio messages and all this different stuff. It's like, well, you wouldn't really need that stuff if people were really gung-ho about following these rules, right?
Right. I guess the same thing about war bonds, right? War bonds are a prime example of that too, where they needed to really make a show to try and sell these things.
Well, let's talk about how has American World War II media and storytelling evolved in the 80 years since the war ended. And would be probably a good part for us to talk a little bit about HBO War.
We've seen quite a few war movies now, Sam and I. The earliest ones we've seen is probably 1957, which was the one about Violet Zebo. That was probably the earliest one. But mostly we've seen more modern ones, which is what I would like to really touch upon. I feel like when you look at war media, the most obvious changing point for me is Saving Private Ryan. Before that, a lot of the movies were about higher-ups making decisions and strategies and these really big themes that were really difficult to understand as a common person. With Saving Private Ryan changed that, and it became this character-driven narrative that then became really popular since. And Saving Private Ryan does something funny. On the one hand, they have this really gruesome, realistic opening on the beach landings in Normandy, which is deemed one of the most realistic war movie scenes ever. And on the other hand, kind of Saving Private Ryan started the myth of this brotherhood in World War II media. It exists, but not to the extent that it's shown in World War II media, I think. And another one of those we've talked about before is No Man Gets Left Behind theory. It also really did not exist in World War II at all, because it was far too grand for that to exist. But yeah, for me, that's the most obvious change in war media between the older ones and the newer ones is the character-driven narrative, which I do enjoy a lot more than the higher-ups talking.
Yeah, I think part of it too is 50 years after World War II ended, with starting to lose all the veterans and that sort of stuff, there was this need to mythologize it, and Saving Private Ryan does that super well. And I would argue that all of the Hank Spielberg collaborations do the same thing, where it's very, here are these people that were the greatest generation. There was something that set them above and apart, and there will never be another generation like that. And as we started to lose these real people and they started to pass into legend, it really became these like stories that did not necessarily reflect what would have been, because a lot of the media that came out during and after the war did not have these kind of sensibilities of we were this band of brothers and we were these mythological larger than life heroes. That would not have been the sense of war media that came out immediately after the war.
Yeah. it's also important to note the people who made Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, these veterans were their peepaws. These were their grandfathers. So a lot of the time they would sit on the knee probably of these men and they'd be regaled with these stories of war and I guess you could say brotherhood or just like, oh, these were peepaw's friends. There's a reverence to it that is almost personal in a way. Like, oh, I see these stories in this light because my grandparents or my grandfather went through that or my great grandfather or a neighbor of mine.
It's very familiar.
Yeah,
Right?
it's very familiar. Yeah. It's very familial also in that way.
Like you're saying, like, of course the stories are familiar, but also they didn't happen to you.
Yeah.
There's something that's been said about Band of Brothers, and that's that these veterans didn't talk about what happened to them in the war until someone came and asked them about it. The creators of Band of Brothers, I feel like they helped these men to start talking about this stuff again, and there's a sense of pride in that, and you can see that in the interviews a lot. I read a research paper by Emily Hoffman called Band of Brothers, The Undermining of Bit Player David Webster's Parachute Infantry. Parachute Infantry is David Webster's memoir about the war. There's a couple of interesting things in that paper. So in Band of Brothers, Easy Company is kind of glorified a little as a company, but in her research paper, Emily Hoffman quotes historian Mark Bando. He says, the company depicted in the series was arguably average in the sense of being a typical company in those 27 total companies of the 101st. They were not the most decorated, they were verifiably not the most wounded, did not suffer the most killed, and they were not in as many days of contact with the enemy as certain other companies. The luck they have is that Stephen Ambrose came and talked to them over other companies. Basically, that's the only reason they've been singled out, really. And when I went on tour in Normandy, our tour guide, Paul Woodage, he made a point of reiterating that Easy Company was not the only company in any of these battles that are shown in Brothers. Fox Company and D Company, and all those companies were involved as well. They just didn't get as much of a spotlight. I'm sure the people in Easy Company were brave, as were the people in Fox Company and D Company. But that's kind of the point. There weren't any braver than any other company.
Yeah, we talk about this sometimes on the podcast about how World War II media made more recently tends to be a story about one special guy or one special group of guys on the backdrop of the largest mass mobilization in history.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Not us pooping on Band of Brothers. You guys were just okay.
I really, really enjoy Band of Brothers. I really enjoy and I really appreciate the interviews with the veterans. I think those people are amazing. I wouldn't be able to do what they did, but at the same time, they got singled out because there were many of them left. Not many of them were off the grid, which happened apparently to the other companies quite a bit, so they couldn't really be found at the time. I think it's good to realize that they weren't the only ones in this war that did things that were worth mentioning.
Yep, I hope that we don't have to state this, but obviously we have a great deal of affection for Band of Brothers and war media in general, but we just enjoy, picking it apart a little bit. That's what we're doing here.
Yes. I would like to recommend this historian called Paul Woodage. I went on tour with him in Normandy, and he has a YouTube channel called World War I TV, on which he discusses lots of interesting things about World War I. And he has a series on there called World War II Myths, in which he debunks a bunch of them. So if you want to get started on this topic of myth making and you would rather not read a book, but you like to watch videos, that might be a good place to start.
That's interesting. Sam, do you have anything you want to throw out there?
I'll try and sort of generalize the whole HBO war thing because I think Masters of the Air is so interesting when you put it up against Band of Brothers and the Pacific. I'm not going to count Generation Kill, although it's a great miniseries. It's not the same war. I definitely have talked about this before on the blog, but I did talk about how Band of Brothers definitely falls into the whole America First, World War II nostalgia, and the Bush regime, as I've said. And The Pacific was made 10 years after Band of Brothers was released. So in 2010, there was almost like a weird sort of uptick in understanding in the general population of war is bad and colonization is bad and imperialism is bad. I'm not saying that I hate the Pacific. Just caveat there. I love the Pacific. It's great. But I definitely do watch that show with a relative, oh, we need to decolonize World War II media now, immediately, because a lot of the Pacific is very much depicting what American soldiers went through and what Japanese soldiers went through, but somehow no Chinese, Korean, Southeast Asian, South Asian, or even Pacific Islander voices are ever heard in the show The Pacific, which is fair considering how the books that were used in the Pacific, Sledge's book, Lecky's book, Basilone's story, were depicting men who were not necessarily fighting in places that were largely populated by the local. But also at the same time, it very much gives like idea of war is so bad because of what it did to our soldiers, these American soldiers and these Japanese soldiers. In the end of the day, we are all alike. Yes, alike in imperialism, sir. You guys are the imperialists. You do realize this, right? Like Americans and Japanese are similar in that you guys are the colonizers here. And the Pacific only ever focuses on their voices, which again, I get it because the books that they based it off, these soldiers did not really. I mean, Sledge went to China, I guess, but that was already toward the end. But these soldiers didn't really make as much contact with local populations that the Japanese were colonizing at the time. But when you think of World War II media, the Pacific is almost like a microcosm of that, in that it's always Americans versus Japanese, and never ever the people that you're stepping on so that you guys can have this big cockfight in the middle. And it's quite interesting.
We said it even in our last episode, how the people that were there in those countries that these big war scenes took place in are so overlooked all the time. They're not talked about because it's a sore subject, right?
It is.
It's an unpopular topic to talk about because it means you have to realize that you've done atrocious things to people who have nothing to do with your conflict.
Yeah.
I think there's a fairly high degree of, call it like amnesia in the United States as well, about the international situations the United States has been embroiled in. I think that most people wouldn't be able to tell you very much about the Spanish-American War. I'm sure Sam is very familiar with the Spanish-American War. And I think that there's a quote by the writer, Diaz, who is from the Dominican Republic. And he says, you probably don't know that the Americans occupied the DR twice in the 20th century. Don't worry, when you have kids, they won't know that the US occupied Iraq either. And I think that really speaks to the sense of the American government does a lot of things in the name of the American people that they're quite good at keeping on the down low or spinning in a certain way or depicting in a certain way. And then people are just unaware that these things are happening. And then there's like this very quick, okay, well, that happened. And then we forget about it a decade later or a couple decades later.
I feel like country leaders do this kind of shit. They just like to pretend stuff didn't happen.
I had read this book called Blowback, The Costs and Consequences of American Empire. And this book came out before 9/11, but the author basically predicted 9/11. He went into this deep dive of American foreign policy since World War II. And he was like, look, anytime that anything sort of blows back on us, you can see all of the, okay, well, the CIA did this. They deposed the democratically elected leader of Chile. They did this, they did that. And then all of this leads to a 9/11. And then the public is blindsided because they don't know or they're not aware of the meaning of all these things that were done in their name behind the scenes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's happening now. I mean, we've talked about it. It's happening now, like late stage capitalism, the economy falling. These are all just consequences of an empire that is failing. And the American citizens, it's so weird coming from, well, I guess because my background is history, I can't let things lie. But it's just so weird watching it from the Philippines and going, girl, the house has been burning for some time. You've only noticed now. That's okay.
Sometimes it's really difficult to see stuff if you're right in the middle of it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Listen, my parents watch American news, the CNN, the Fox News, whatever. If you're relying on those news channels for your news, you're going to have call it a certain perspective of what's been going on.
I want to just add a little bit of Band of Brothers talk, specifically Webster, because in the research paper by Emily, she makes an interesting observation, which is that a lot of the Easy Company veterans published their memoirs after Band of Brothers. If you compare that to Webster's memoir, which was written right after the war, so before the series came out, all of the titles of the newer memoirs that came out after the series have Band of Brothers or the mention of brother in the title. And Webster's does not have that, and the word brother actually only features one time in the actual book. The memoirs that came after Band of Brothers mention brotherhood a lot more. It makes you wonder if they were in any way influenced by the series, just like us. Like, they're not immune to propaganda or just being influenced.
In the Samet book that I read, Looking for the Good War, and she's a professor at West Point, so I just feel like her perspective on this is really interesting. But she was talking about how in World War II, for Americans, the Civil War was as far back for them as World War II is for us, right? About like 80 years. They had come out of the Civil War, and there was really this national need to be like, all right, how do we bury this hatchet? And of course, this is a very white perspective on the matter, but they were nationally like, okay, how do we come back from this? And part of it was, you know, when they fought in the Spanish-American War, a lot of the ideas that were being propagated were putting aside our differences. It's about brotherhood. It's brother bearing the hatchet with brother, brothers coming back together, this sort of thing. So there's this like very strong idea of trying to tie the nation back together with this idea that like, oh, we're all brothers here. And then that provided a template for the way that Americans started to remember World War II and the decades later. So I thought that was like a really interesting like comparison that she drew.
Yes. Yeah. But it is worth mentioning that another reason for this could be that Webster was a really unpopular soldier. If any of you have read Malarkey's book, which is one of my favorite memoirs from the Easy Company guys, alongside Webster's one actually, so that's funny. But Malarkey says about the brothers, he says, I didn't like everything about the book or the movie. I wish Ambrose had included a handful of guys he ignored, instead of dwelling so much on a big player like David Canyon Webster. So he really, really disliked him. He mentioned Webster about 4 times in his book, all negative.
Oh yeah, I read about that. I remember that.
It makes sense, right? From his point of view, I kind of get it, because Malarkey was the one who served the longest in Easy Company. He was never wounded. He was never sent home. He was in every battle. And Webster was one of those soldiers who didn't like to stick his neck out, so he wasn't in all the battles. So if you compare those two people, I can understand why Malarkey would think that way about him. Webster's book was not so much anti-war as it was anti-military, because he very much opposed to Nazi ideas, but he hated being in the army.
Yeah, the way that I was reading Parachute Infantry, I was reading it while I was in my military job, and I was seeing the same things he was complaining about were very similar to what I was seeing and what I was experiencing and what I was also hating on at the time. And it was just so funny to me that the same petty dalliance between officers and the military in the 1940s, you know, America, all the way in Europe, is very similar to 21st century Philippine military politics. He's one of my favorite characters for that very reason. And there definitely is a sort of surliness and a sardonicness and almost like irreverence to the way that he sees the military that I feel like Band of Brothers does not as a whole. So,
it's funny. I'll give one more example and then I'll stop talking about David Webster. But if you look at the way he describes the battle for the island versus the way Winters described it. Winters described it as the high point of Easy Company's time in the war because everybody was exemplary in that battle. And Webster calls him a bad leader because they were under attack from their own artillery and it was chaotic and dangerous, and at least he thought so. So they have these two very different points of view about the very same battle, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, there's something to be said for taking one person, in this situation, Dick Winters, but of course this happens in all war media. But there's a danger in making someone a quote unquote hero, because like a hero is not a real person.
But this is from Dick Winters' memoirs, right? So he must have legitimately thought that this was a successful mission. And it's just funny to me how two people can be fighting in the exact same battle, in the exact same war even, and yet feel so completely different about it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole point, right? If you look at the narratives from people who were actually there, especially the ones that came out during the war or immediately after the war when memories were fresh and all that sort of stuff, someone had done like an oral history where they interviewed tons of people, not just soldiers, but civilians and workers and all this stuff. And in this oral history, the perspectives were so different. You know, no two people had the exact same idea of how things had gone and what had happened and how events had played out. So I just think that's kind of the whole point. Like what you're saying is that
Memory,
memory is funny and the way that we remember things is funny. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think what's
Right.
interesting too is that David Webster's Parachute Infantry, or if you read Helmet for My Pillow by Bob Leckie, these are two people who were already looking at things the way a writer would look at things. And one of the things they left out of the Pacific is that Helmet for My Pillow ends with like a very critical note about the use of the atomic bomb. And so these are two men who like were a bit more critical of the military structure and like were a bit more aware of what was going on and the impact it would have. And it's so interesting to see that perspective against your average whoever writing a memoir.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes you think about whether level of education also plays into this. I'm sure it does. I'm sure a specific way of thinking is necessary to be critical, especially if you're right in the middle of it. So,
yeah.
Interesting.
Let's talk about the like real world impact of American war media. I found an article that was talking about these adventure magazines that were super, super popular in the decades after World War II, literally would sell millions and millions of copies to American men every month. And they were these magazines that basically like the United States was a bastion of freedom. They were defending against the evils of communism and these very heroic manly tales of he always gets the girl and he always defeats the Nazis and whatever. And this article was talking about how basically the quote is, the boys who would be sent to fight a war of counterinsurgency in Vietnam grew up fighting an imaginary version of World War II. Many would be sorely disappointed that reality hardly matched the pulp magazine's fantasies.
Yeah, I mean, there's really no other way of looking at it. And the way I see it is it definitely is. I mean, the only word really is mythologized. A lot of this propaganda is what ends up inspiring people to go into a war that they're not prepared for, nor do they understand fully. That's why Masters of the Air interests me so much, because it's being peddled to a generation that is very, very irreverent. A generation that is very critical of war as a whole. Especially with what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, and as well as Palestine and Israel, that this thing, from what I remember, there are not many American soldiers on the ground as of the moment in Israel and Palestine and in Ukraine and Russia. So there's a sort of like almost very removed sort of perspective at the moment for American media. But they definitely are having a very difficult time peddling the idea of like great American war in a time of great mass information, which is quite interesting to look at. We're mythologizing these real people who have gone through real trauma in order to inspire other people to go through the same trauma.
I think in the decades after World War II, there was Korea and then Vietnam and then various wars in the Middle East. And every time the common trend seems to be this invocation of this World War II idea of Americans as the bulwark against authoritarianism.
And the savior.
Yeah, exactly. And it's bringing back this idea of, well, we were the good guys once, so therefore we must always be the good guys. And the things that we do are always correct. And then obviously Vietnam was a clusterfuck. I have this quote here from retired Rear Admiral Jean Larocque, who said, "We see things in terms of that war," he's talking about World War II, "which in a sense was a good war. But the twisted memory of it encourages the men of my generation to be willing, almost eager, to use military force anywhere in the world."
It's so true. And to be fair, like oppressors say the same thing. They also say when they oppress a country, very often it's under the pretense of we are coming here to save you or to make your life better.
It's very interesting how I don't know if it's the same for other American colonized places, but I remember very distinctly American propaganda regarding the Philippines was also very much based on brotherhood. Like, oh, these are our little brown brothers that we have to teach. And you should see the pictures that they put out with this propaganda. It's terrible. I don't look like that anyway. But yeah, this idea of these little brown brothers. Oh, we're here, this benevolent assimilation that we're trying to help you with. You're our little brown brothers. Forget about the violence that happened a while ago. It's fine. We're your big brother. We're going to help you. And so the idea of brotherhood is very pervasive in American propaganda. I mean, it comes up in Band of Brothers, it comes up in the Pacific, in Masters of the Air. And it also comes up in their colonizing war propaganda. But yeah, it's like that.
This episode is running a little bit longer than what we were expecting, so we're cutting it up into 2 episodes and we'll be back with part 2 next week. But before we go, let's do what we usually do, which is tell the people what we're reading. And I'm still reading the same thing I was when I was last recording with Sam, so I'll hand it over to the other two. Sam, are you reading anything?
As of the moment, I'm rereading Jane Austen Persuasion.
Nice. I am reading Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad by Matthew F. Delmont, because we are covering Red Tails next week.
Yay!
Well, thanks everyone for listening. We're super excited to have done this episode. We might come back to it in the future and touch on it again. But you can follow us at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast on Instagram. You can also follow us anywhere you listen to podcasts and give us 5 stars. Mart, can you reiterate the URL for the website so everyone can go check that out?
Yeah, you can find us on rosieTheReviewer.com if you would like some more background information.
Perfect. And other than that, like I said, we'll be covering Red Tails next week. And thanks again so much for listening.
Bye!
Bye.
Bye.